Well, I'd like to thank you both for participating in today's editorial board discussion. I think the area is fortunate to have two candidates like yourself running for office, and we look forward to talking about the events ahead of us. We've been doing these sessions for about 15 years, and I think they've provided invaluable information to the public through the stories and the editorials that we've written. The process we're going to go through is we're just going to go around the table asking questions from each of us. If anybody has a follow-up question they want to ask during that time, they can go ahead and do that. There'll be no time limit on the answers, but if I think things are dragging on, kind of to move things along. So, anybody have any questions about anything right now? Why don't we go ahead and get started? And I'll start out and we'll just kind of go around the table this way. Kurt, I'd like to start with you, and I'll follow up with you, Bob, on this. I'd like to talk about your intentions for running. Kurt, I know at the time you stepped down from city council. I was under the impression, maybe wrongly so, that you were kind of done with politics at that time, but you're obviously back in the running, and I'm curious what made you decide to run.
Well, I think, first of all, my intentions from stepping down for city council were really twofold. Number one, I felt like there was a lot that I had accomplished. I thought there was a lot that we, as a body of council, working with the administration, with the city, had accomplished. And I felt like the city was back on the right track. I've talked numerous times throughout this campaign about where the city came from 2008 and 2009 and where it's emerged in 2013 and 14. And quite frankly, I didn't feel as if I had a lot of personal challenges left in my role as a city councilor. I wanted to use the talents and skills that I had to make the city a better place to live, and a better place to start your business, to grow your business, and raise your family. And I felt as if we had accomplished that in 4 years. I decided to move on, and also began to look at the landscape and see that there, with Representative Huffman term limited, there wasn't anyone who was jumping to the forefront in my mind to run for this seat, and we were going to need a strong voice in Columbus to represent us as well. My experience with Columbus at that time was pretty much limited to the local government funding cuts that we received with the city and the difficulty that we had with that. But as I researched the position more, I found out about the spending issues that Columbus still continues to have to this day, and became more and more excited about the opportunity to potentially do or carry on the work that I had at the city down at the State House. So with that in mind, first and foremost, I mean, I think that was probably the main inspiration I had for continuing or moving on or trying to move up into this position.
Bob, you've held a lot of different positions in Columbus. You've done the Supreme Court, and the Senate, and the State House. Some people are wondering, do we need new blood down there? You've been there for a while. Is it time to have somebody new down there? How would you answer these people?
Well, I think that that's a good question, and we need to, I think, keep in mind that we still live in pretty difficult and challenging times. A lot of uncertainty as to what the economy is going to do, what the national economy is going to do, what the state budget is going to be, and it's time that we still need a very effective voice that has experience in being able to accomplish things that are going to move our economy forward, help the state and our community grow jobs. Also somebody that's experienced in the area of the criminal justice. We've got a new heroin epidemic that's spreading throughout the state. It requires some adjustments in the laws in order to be able to help curb that. And so I'm running because I think we do need somebody to replace what we have as a very effective state representative, Matt Huffman. Somebody who can work with our Senate President, who represents Allen County, Keith Faber, and be able to step right in on day one and take up take up those duties and get things done for Adams County.
Sure. Kurt talked yesterday about wanting to get more money back to taxpayers from the state budget. I'm curious about both of you and your stance on reducing the current state spending and what you would cut if you in fact want to see state budget reduced. Why don't you go first? This is my first last time.
Well, I think first of all, we have to understand that we are coming out from a very low point in state spending. And so as the economy begins to improve, revenue to the state is going to improve as well. And so some of those things that got serious budget cuts, and they were spread, the pain was spread pretty much across the board. Because in a recession, nobody is exempt. So our schools got this significant funding reductions. Of course, the local government fund took serious hits. So as the funding begins to go back up to normal levels, there's going to be perhaps a little extra growth, but it's just making up for lost ground. You know, and so I'm not entirely sure that. In fact, I'm not sure that we need less. Funding spending by the state at this point, because we're still making up for lost ground. And so the statistics are a little odd. It's actually about 20% growth in the general fund over 4 years, so that's 5% a year, making up for DEPS, which was when the state revenue fell off. It was equivalent to fall off. I mean, this is not a a slowdown in the growth. This is a drop to what it was in 1932. So that's how significant it was in the midst of the Great Depression. And so it's just getting back to normal. And yes, you've got to restrain state growth as it goes forward and make sure that you don't take from the taxpayer more than is needed for essential services. But if you're going to make up for the local government fund, if you're going to get schools back up to where they need to be, and remember, what they don't get from the state, they're going to ask local property tax payers for. And so there's going to be some catch-up, and then I think you can, make sure the growth is moderate, and that would be, of course, in terms of returning, lowering the taxes or whatever it takes to make sure the taxpayers keep their money, use it on their family needs.
I would just start by saying that 22% over 4 years. I've had a state representative, friends with the current state representative I'm friends with, tell me and provide numbers to back it up. I've got documentation here from the Legislative Services Commission that that's the highest 4-year spending increase by the governor in the last 50 years in Ohio, and that's a fact. We are spending more money today. Some of that is federal funding, some of that is Medicaid dollars. We have to aggressively attack cost drivers if we're going to drive down costs to the taxpayer. 51% of the state budget right now is wrapped up in Medicaid, and that's a tough place to attack because it is 2/3 federally funded, and because there are federal mandates attached to that. We didn't need to expand Medicaid in this state. I think part of the problem, if I had a criticism of state government right now, I've been very happy with a number of the things that our governor has done, but I think that the governor also has an eye on the White House in 2016. I think he's worried. I think the Medicaid expansion was more about, and especially the fashion in which the Medicaid expansion took place, was more about his next job than his current one. I think there's a number of ways that we can look at reducing spending. I think we've seen a highway patrol that now goes into our communities and has taken some of that off of the local governments, but at the same point, they could have just not taken the money from the local governments in the first place. I think we have departments that continue to grow, job and family services, regulatory bodies that continue to grow because we increasingly regulate our businesses and our taxpayers. I think there's a lot of ways, again, that we can examine it, but I think we have to examine the budget line by line. And I know that's an awesome task, and I know people say, well, you can't do that. It is an awesome task in a budget that's the size of the state of Ohio's. However, I think it's something that needs to be done. And I think we have to look for, I think we have to also look at our agencies and expect them to figure out the ways to cut their own budgets. It's hard to equate a 3% across the board cut to a 3% reduction in services. It can be more dramatic or less dramatic. You can't just say, well, we're going to cut across the board, because one agency or one group of people didn't share the pain when we had the recession. That was the legislature. And that includes not eliminating the ridiculous $50 per person political tax credit that's literally indefensible in the state of Ohio. The politicians have found an end around to give tax credits back to people who fund their campaigns, up to $100 per joint filing company. That's roughly $5 million a year. Now, is that going to make or break a budget? No, but it's a step in the right direction.
One of the challenges in any primary is to have voters distinguish between two fairly similar candidates in terms of how they think. So how the governor has acted is sort of a bellwether. In what ways, Kurt, starting with you, do you look at decisions that Governor Kasich has made and think to yourself, if I were in the State House, I would applaud him on that?
I think spending, first and foremost, is a big issue. I think the Medicaid expansion. People inherently don't like politicians. And the maneuver to use the state controlling board to expand Medicaid in the state, it was one of the, probably one of the reasons, one of the examples that you look at first before all others and say, this is why people don't like politics. Because we had two individuals who were competing, two individuals who sat on the state controlling board representing the state House of Representatives that were potential candidates, or continue to be potential candidates for the next speaker's job. And rather than force either one into making a politically difficult or politically damaging vote on the expansion of Medicaid, Speaker Batchelder, I'm sure at the request of the governor, removed them and replaced them with two individuals who were term limited, and thus able to make that decision much easier, or much less accountable to their constituents.
Bob, in what ways have you differed with the governor?
Well, I think probably in two respects, well, maybe three respects. First of all, I think the fact that when they were formulating the budget, that they put a lot of the economic pain down into local governments in order to balance the state budget is something that I disagree with, having served as a county commissioner. And understanding that we get most of our services from local government. When we had a bad winter and somebody needed to plow the roads, it was the county and the townships that were plowing the roads. We need emergency medical services, not the state was going to send an ambulance. It's going to be our township or our city. And same way with law enforcement. So I certainly disagree with doing that, and I think it's time in the next budget to be able to restore those funds to the local government so that they can provide the services we all want. It's no mystery that many townships and local governments now have property tax levies on the ballot to make up for that loss of funds, just to provide the basic services that residents need. So that's one area. The other area is also, and I would agree in this sense with Kurt, that the governor going ahead found the legislature essentially to enact Medicaid expansion was not something that I think is appropriate. Part of that is the legislature's fault because, just like Congress, over the years they've delegated more authority to the executive branch of government and set up things so that the governor or the president can make those decisions instead of where it ought to reside, and that is in the legislative body that represents all the people in the state of Ohio. And then I suppose the third thing is in the area of energy development. That would be fracking in eastern Ohio. What an amazing thing that is. I just wonder what our gas bills this winter would have been like had we not had this development in fracking and gas development in eastern Ohio and in Pennsylvania. But the governor wants to put a significant severance tax on that in order to do tax cuts elsewhere. Whatever the benefits of that may be, we don't want to drive that industry away, we develop it. Some of those counties in eastern Ohio have been in economic difficulty for many, many years. It's finally an opportunity to put money in the pockets of some of those individuals. We should encourage that. I would compliment our state representative, Matt Huffman, who worked out an agreement with the oil and gas industry. And these are local producers. These are big folks. These are the local guys that have been doing it for years to increase the severance tax somewhat, but use that money to make sure that the inspections and everything occur timely. And so I think the governor is a little excessive on that.
I think both of you have spoken about creating jobs locally. How can you do that from the State House in Columbus, help grow jobs locally in the Southwest?
Well, first of all, you have to establish the business climate in order for that to occur. And that involves several things. It involves keeping the taxes low and reasonable, and yet being able to provide for essential services, because businesses depend on essential services. Making sure that the regulations are limited and reasonable. And then finally, helping to ensure that we have a quality education for a skilled workforce. Businesses will go where they think they can find the qualified workers, and then there are jobs where businesses are having a hard time filling them because people don't have the technical skills they need for those jobs. So adequately funding our education, our vocational education programs is an important part of that process. But then there's more than that. It's also, many times, trying to intervene with state officials when they have the economic incentives to bring jobs in, to make sure that Allen County isn't overlooked. I know many of those decision makers personally, and they know me, and I think I would at least be able to get in the door. That doesn't mean that they're going to do whatever I ask, but it'll help. And then, as a county commissioner, I've often met with the Allen Economic Development Group and what their current projects are. And because as a county, the commissioners often have to approve tax abatements and other things in order to complete the incentive to have a business expansion. And so I would, if they are open to that, I would be happy and would like to meet with them to know what the current projects are going on and where I can be helpful. And I'd be happy to go with them on making calls on businesses, either here locally or prospective ones that are wanting to come in. And I think perhaps I would bring some credentials along that might help to open some doors along that line as well. So I would be going to be very hands-on, not just in Columbus, but also as much locally as possible.
I appreciate that question, and I think this is a difference. I think this highlights a difference between my opponent and I. There's a difference between what you're going to do or what you will do and what you're doing already. Economic development has changed significantly since 2000, since Bob Taft was in office. And as a city councilor, yeah, we approved tax abatements, so do local school boards. But economic development requires more than that. And right now in Ohio, Jobs Ohio is running the game with the Regional Growth Partnership. And I applaud the governor's efforts on economic development. I think we've seen successes. I think we've seen successes locally here with the change in leadership of the Allen Economic Development Group and the refocus, the new energy that we see surrounding the Port Authority. Our Port Authority actually now has bonding authority for Van Wert County's mega site, and potentially looking next at Wapak and their mega site, and collaborative efforts that might be able to happen on a regional level, because the fact is, what's good in Allen County is good in Van Wert County and Putnam County and Hardin County and Auglaize County as well. We can't continue to operate as this state did it many times, which was in a silo where we often competed for site selection as much against other entities within the state as we did with other states. I mean, you see countless examples of, well, Van Wert and Ottawa were fighting over this business, and then we ended up losing it to Indiana during those years. I think one thing in Columbus that could be incredibly effective is really someone to push a federal defense consortium similar to what we're seeing at the JSMC right now locally. I think we look at the other states that we're competing for these federal military dollars with, defense contractor dollars with, Alabama, Virginia, North Carolina, and they have statewide consortiums that are lobbying, providing one unified voice for advocacy for jobs in Ohio, in Washington, D.C. And I think it's important that we get that established now, because we are not going to be blessed with our federal legislators being in the same key committee assignments, and of course the Speaker of the House, much longer. I mean, those things are going to change over time, and it's important that we get our ducks in a row for something like that locally. The Regional Growth Partnership was there with the recent expansion at Ford, and the Regional Growth Partnership and Jobs Ohio were there to help turn a brownfield site in the old Triplet building in Bluffton into a site working with a local manufacturer who was already here to expand jobs and create economic activity in a building that had really developed into an eyesore in the community of Bluffton, in the beautiful community of Bluffton. So I think, and I guess last, if someone needs some capital, I guess I might be able to help them out with that as well. So, you know, there's a lot of, I say that facetiously. Yeah, but we say, but I think that's where it really comes down to it. You know, I've been on the ground with the Island Economic Development Group, I've worked with the Chamber of Commerce, and it's not to say Bob hasn't, but I've been incredibly involved with these organizations for the past 9 to 10 years. I work with businesses quite frequently at the credit union. I always say, people, when they ask me in my private career, what's the neatest thing about your job? I always say the things that people do to make a living. Because we see some of the neatest things that you would never expect people to make a living, but you don't understand that everything that we touch in a day is made by someone. Everything that we see in a day, someone made that, or someone provided that service, and someone's generating an income, and for government, generating income tax revenue for us.
May I follow up on that?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll just go back and indicate that when I was a county commissioner, we actually created the Port Authority that has now evolved over time to do these things. So a lot of the seeds that you plant through the creativity that you exhibit at the time have long-term payoffs. And so it is a good idea to have, you know, an eye on the future as well. I would, and of course I agree that a statewide consortium for the defense thing is probably the thing that's going to be more effective than every individual community doing. That's not to take away from what we're doing here. It's just to speak with a louder voice. I think would be helpful. So I support those efforts as well, and work with the legislators and the other communities in order to get that going. I would also add, when we talk about business climate to help produce private sector job growth, one of the things that used to be a huge detriment here in Ohio was the workers' compensation system. And in the 90s, I led the effort to reform the system. We had several bills that went through that I sponsored. These were almost knockdown, drag-out battles. The system was totally dysfunctional. And that those were successful. They worked. And last year, the system was able to make a rebate to employers of $1 billion. So those things, I think, do pay off benefits. The legislative process can be a very creative one, you know, not in a common sense type of way. What are the needs? What are all the possible solutions? How can you put things together from maybe different areas that most people, you know, wouldn't think about, to develop something that's then going to grow and be a practical solution to the problems that we have? And so, one of the jobs of a legislator in accomplishing these things is to be creative in the process. To do that, you have to have kind of a kind of a long background, broad background in these areas to be able to put pieces that many people wouldn't think of together to form the solution.
On the lines of economic development, as we go down this private-public partnership path we're taking, share your thoughts on transparency that needs to be involved in that. And for one token, we hear that we, as economic development people, we have to do things and we have to keep quiet because we don't want to tip people off. But the other token is we need to be guardians of the public's funds. So share your thoughts on your position on that, I guess.
Sure. It is a very fine line, Jim, and I'm not sure I can necessarily answer for you what that distinction is today. I think it's almost like, I believe it was Oliver Wendell Holmes when he said, "I know it when I see it." You know, the transparency issue is such that there is an amount of secrecy and privacy that needs to occur, especially as it pertains to state financial incentives. Because if that is, it's like bid specs on a construction project. If everyone knows what their competitors are bidding, chances are they're going to undercut your bid for that business. At the same point, as with any time that you're spending or rebating, I guess in the case of tax incentives, giving that money that is public dollars back in terms of corporate welfare or just in terms of tax abatements, you also have to be very judicious guardians of the taxpayer dollar and of the treasury. So I know this sounds kind of like a cop-out answer, but it is a difficult thing to do. I don't think that we can, I think you almost have to, the approach we've taken now is probably a little too private, but I also think that we need to be extremely forthcoming after the fact with those incentives and with those packages to make sure that the public is aware exactly of what companies are getting after the fact. It just, I would hate to lose a project based on transparency, but I would also hate for fraud to occur because of a lack of transparency. So there is a dilemma of sorts over that public-private partnership that Jobs Ohio models out.
Well, as you know, in my capacity as Chief Legal Counsel for the Auditor of State, we've been doing some negotiation with Jobs Ohio over their audit. And I just want to say for the record here, I speak for myself and not for the Auditor of State, so we'll make that clear. And I know companies are very sensitive about information they provide in order to get economic incentives. And if they feel that their information is going to be prematurely disclosed, they won't come to play. And we'll lose opportunities to get more jobs in Ohio. So to that extent, we have to honor what makes private enterprise work, and that is to be able to have a competitive edge on their competitors. At the same time, when you have public dollars involved, the public needs to know where they're going, and that's why when you have tax abatement things, after they're negotiated, when they come for a public hearing, those are public, they have to be public approved. You might say, well, yes, but you know, for the horses out of the barn after that point, but you won't even get to negotiations if they can't have some measure of confidence. But if we're talking about local abatements and things, those at one point do get disclosed and publicly approved. We're talking about Jobs Ohio, that's an entirely different model, because if you view it as having privatized the state revenue stream, they're operating as a not-for-profit private corporation, so the money that they, at least their theory is, the money that they're using is not public dollars anymore. And the legislature has indicated that in the statute, it's no longer public dollars. So they do have some quite extensive reporting periods after the fact. I think we have to see how this works. And I agree with Kurt, there's no real, right line for a lot of these things. And so as experience develops where we need more, public, disclosure, legislature should go ahead and enact that. I think one of the things that will keep everything on track is a proper audit of their activities. And they're required to have audits. And the question is, how extensive are they going to be? If it's done by a private firm now, but the auditor state has input into determining what is going to be looked at. And so I think that's an important safeguard. And this is very early in the stage. We'll just have to see how it plays out. But certainly the public deserves to know how it's going.
I agree, but if I may follow up with that.
Sure.
I agree. I mean, I think an extensive audit is vital to that organization. I know both of us did a great job of kind of dancing around the subject, but it's in its infancy, and it's something that, as state representative, either one of us would be tasked with really monitoring that as a member of the legislative body and making long-term decisions that are going to affect Ohio and the economic development.
Do you think it's constitutional? What's been created?
I do.
Are you allowed to answer that?
I believe he's a former.
Yeah. Well, I think the odds are that it is constitutional. There are some constitutional challenges. Right now, the U.S. Supreme Court is deciding who can make the challenge, as opposed to whether to answer the actual challenge to it. So we're still waiting on that, and we'll have to see what the court decides. But in the meantime, I think it's fully up and operational, and the Jobs Ohio is starting to use the funds from what used to be the revenue from the liquor stream. Went into the 166 account, and that was the non-tax dollars. It was always considered non-tax dollars, public dollars, but non-tax dollars. So you could do things with it that the Constitution wouldn't let you do with tax dollars. So Jobs Ohio now has that revenue stream, and they're just beginning to do things with it. There was a job announcement of, was it 1,400 jobs in Cincinnati that we're involved with. We'll just have to see how this plays out. It would be interesting, just as an aside, it would be interesting if the court said it was constitutional, how you unwind this thing.
Yeah.
We're talking about workers' comp. Obviously, Ohio is the only state in the country that has a system like we have here. That's my understanding of it. That is a
Several.
We're the largest property casualty insurer in the world.
Having gone through the one reform that you did, would you support switching it over to that more private system in the way that most of the states run their workers' comp program?
Ohio had a referendum on that some years ago, which was it was an initiative, and most of even at the point when it wasn't working very good, you had the business groups, the labor groups, the farm groups all opposing that, and I think that today, while there may be some support for it, in general, those who pay the bill are much happier with the way it runs, and I think there's still going to be tremendous opposition to changing to a different system.
I agree. Most of the employers I've spoke with, for which workers' compensation is a large concern, and it's a large concern for everyone, but it's more so for folks that are more likely to utilize the system than, such as, or not like an office environment or something like that. And there seems to be, as much as it surprises me, there does seem to be a lot of disinterest in switching from a public to a private system. Generally, I think the private sector would be a more appropriate method for workers' compensation and for insurance, but the people who are paying the bill, and it is funded by those that utilize it, are in favor of it, and as long as they're in favor of it, whether it's a state-run agency or not, they still have every right to utilize the cooperative principles that they're utilizing now. So I wouldn't advocate for any changes.
It would take a change to the Ohio Constitution. It would be difficult, at least maybe.
Speaking of things that may be constitutional or not, let's talk about school funding for a little bit. Kurt, we'll start with you. What do you think is the proper way to fund a school system, and how do you think it'll affect the districts within Allen County where you would represent?
The proper way is an interesting question. It's one that's eluded legislators in Ohio for a number of years. I think we need to look at a funding stream that is reliable and student-focused. And when I say that, right now, you guys just wrote an editorial last week on the effects of vouchers, and I think even more so than vouchers, it's just that of open enrollment. And I think dollars are going to, while I'm not a huge proponent of the current system of vouchers, I support the concept of competition in education, and we all recognize the importance of parental involvement in a child's development and in a child's education. And we look at that and we say, well, the difference between District A and District B is the parents care over here and the parents don't care over here. And yet, with vouchers, the opposition seems to defy the right of a parent to make a choice for their child on the best setting for their child to receive an education. And I think that parents are going to make those decisions better for their own children, or more qualified to make that decision for their own children, and rightfully should be making that decision for their own children. As it pertains to funding, I think there are two distinctions of what it is not. One is that we cannot make our funding and we cannot make our teacher evaluations based on test scores. I think there is we can't hold a teacher accountable for the number of completely accountable for the number of facts that go into what a test score is. Some of which is, we all know that some people just don't take standardized tests very well. The other thing that would make identifying that revenue stream for education and working it long term would be to set the standards for our education and leave them alone for more than one governor's administration. One of the things that always bothers me when we examine Ohio's education system is every time that we elect a new governor, we seem to move the target. And those are tweaks sometimes, and sometimes they're major transformations of what it is that our students need to achieve to graduate. And we're never going to reach a metric when every time we start to implement a plan, as soon as 4 years, we change the target. So I think that's one thing. I mean, I think Ohio needs to look at a 20-year funding cycle. I say 20 just as a roundabout good long-term number of, we need to identify what our funding is going to look like for education for that 20-year plan, set a target for that 20-year plan, and then work it and measure it, benchmark it properly, and see what the effects are. We can make tweaks throughout the plan, but I think it's premature to make funding decisions or to change funding levels or to change targets much sooner than that, because we're not able to see the evolution of allowing teachers to do what they do best, administrators to do what they do best, which is set curriculum and instruct our students.
Bob, we're waiting for years
Well,
for you to answer this
Answer
question.
to the question about what to do with school funding first. Academic changes is a whole separate ball of wax. Well, when I left the legislature, we had a functioning school funding formula. Of course, nobody's ever happy with it, because you have 612 school districts, you have that have a high property valuation, you have districts that have low property valuation, you have districts that have low income, you have districts that have high income. So a funding formula has to try to take into account all these differences and provide enough funds for an adequate education. And it's a difficult thing, but we had a functioning school funding formula. Now, I think there's been 4 of them since that time. There isn't a permanent one now, it's ad hoc. So I think the first thing we need to do is to get a permanent functioning school funding formula in place that does the best job possible of ensuring every student in every school district has enough money for an adequate education. And we can do that. Then you fine tune it as you go along. You make improvements where you need to do it. So that would be the first step. Also, I think it's important that the state devote a considerable amount of its state resources to funding education, because the alternative is that local residents are asked to pay more property taxes. Now, there's also an income tax option at the local level, and many schools have done that, and it's been hugely a help. I'm not sure in this last recession, maybe for the first time ever, those revenues actually dipped. So we devote a considerable amount of the state budget to making sure that that you have enough money to fund the system. So, and I think that will be a big help. Always, we're going to have a local share because the local community needs to participate in educating their children. But the state money is to help level it off, not level off, to bring the bottom up so that every district has proper funding for adequate education to prepare the children for the future.
And where would this increased state funding come from?
It would come from growth in the state. It may require a little shifting in the priorities in the state budget, but as you go forward, it will come from the growth in the revenue. If we get our business climate going, more people working, more people are paying taxes, the state revenue increases, and that large percentage of that needs to be devoted to school funds.
If I could piggyback on that, the problem is I meet with local legislators or local administrators, school administrators, all the way up to I had the opportunity to meet with the president of my university recently, and school board members, whomever. You ask them the question, and it's the $1 million question surrounding education. It says, what's the dollar figure you need per student to ensure that they can pass the standard that at the time was the Ohio graduation exam or whatever? What's that dollar figure? If you say, take all questions of realistic funding out of it. We're not going to be realistic for a second. We're going to say, is it $10,000? Is it $15,000 a student? Is it $20,000 a student? What does it take? And the problem is that all of our students are different. And it might take $5,000 to educate one student. It takes $8,000 to educate another. So where the long-term portion of that comes in is we need a workable plan that says we need to set a figure. We need to define that figure of what it's going to take. We need to try and measure an average across the state, what that number is going to be, and find a way to fund it. Now, find a way to fund it is an ambiguous term, and it leads you to believe that we're going to raise taxes later. But we do need, we can try and find ways to fund it, but we don't even have the first part of the answer to the question yet, and that is, what is it actually going to take to fund it properly?
And that's what you do when you determine the school funding formula. That's the major question involved, and there's going to be different opinion about that. But the legislature, with all the input, has to come to some figure that's going to work. It's going to be suitable, and then you go with it. Now, I'm not sure, what the proposal for a 20-year funding plan is, but I've always thought that what we need to do is to put money in to forward fund our schools 1 year in advance, because now the budget gets adopted and schools have already made their plans because it cuts into their year. And so if you did it 1 year in advance, it would give a little more predictability to know what they're going to have, so the local schools can manage their school better. And as the economy improves and the state gets additional revenue, now would be the good time to do that, to move that into an education trust fund in order to forward fund the schools 1 year. And that would provide some predictability and stability, which school administrators really need, and to be able to efficiently and properly manage the local schools.
Kind of going down the same path, governor seems more interested in lowering the income tax rate than providing additional money to local governments and schools. He's even advocating what I would consider to be a shifting of taxes from income tax to taxing other items, but even that is not taking that additional tax revenue and pushing it back down to local governments. So as a legislator, what would be your position on state income tax, and funding, additional taxing of, different services and items, and funding local government? I guess you're correct.
Yeah, I mean, the most recent income tax was funded by a sales tax increase, a cigarette tax increase, and the creation of a new tax, the severance tax. And that shifting around of taxes is always going to be, the problem with that sort of attitude is it's always going to be subject to the kind of the flavor of the month sort of ideal, where one governor is going to say, well, we'd rather have a sales tax than an income, and lower the income tax. We'd rather have more income tax and lower the sales tax to drive consumer spending. So there's going to be a million different, or at least several different economic theories on that, and some of them multiple theories might be correct. I would advocate at the time, or as we currently speak, I would advocate for actually looking at the income tax. I think businesses make this decision all the time. They have to decide whether they want to be the best product in the marketplace, the cheapest product in the marketplace, or the best value in the marketplace. If you're not one of those three things, you generally have trouble making a lot of headway in business. I think we need to decide whether we want to have the lowest personal income taxes in the state, whether we want to be the cheapest place to live, whether we want to have the greatest amount of government amenities of a state in the union, or whether or not we want to provide the best value. And I think the current tact is to try and provide a great value. We're going to incrementally decrease the sales tax. We're going to take 1/4% here and 1/4% there as we can to return dollars that are saved or new dollars that are generated back to the taxpayers that paid them in. I advocate for that approach. I think that there does need to be a value proposition. Excuse me. I think we need to balance the interest of our local government fund, of our educational funding system, and of unfortunately, Medicaid services that the state is required to provide. I think we need to balance those interests and provide a good value while we're providing those services at what is a good value to the taxpayer, at what is a good cost to the taxpayer. So I don't know if that completely answers your question or not, but I think I would advocate for, without saying that I would take the tax rates to zero. I think we all look at it and say, if we go to zero, we've got to find a way to pay for the basic services that we provide. So while I'm an advocate for lower taxes, I think it's realistic to say that we can't just have no taxes, that we can't have no form of taxation. So I advocate for the value approach, which is we balance out the level of services that we want to provide with the cost that it's going to take to provide them.
I'm not sure I agree with all of the discussion. I'm not sure I actually understand all of the discussion, but I would agree with the conclusion that we have to determine what are our essential services, what does it cost to provide them, and then we have to have a level of taxation that does that. What do the citizens want? What do the citizens need? Now, I'm a believer in skinny government, lean government, so that you pare down what it costs to actually provide those services, And I think Ohio is at somewhat of a historic low point in the number of state government employees. So it's moving in that direction, and I would continue that trend. Now, in terms of what the level of taxation will be specifically, and whether we do shifting from one form to another, tax policy experts will tell you need sort of a balance, not put all of your eggs in one basket in one type of taxes, but to have them somewhat over a broad range of things. And that tends to provide a little stability, it tends to provide fairness to the taxpayer. So that would be a goal that I would have as well, is that you have a balance of taxes, from sales tax and income tax and other types of taxes that are collected. Now, where that line is, I think that depends on the dynamics of your economy and the state, and what all the demands are on the government, and what the needs are, what the essential services are.
So are you agreeing then that lowering income tax and raising sales tax is fair and balanced for the taxpayers of the state of Ohio? What the governor did in the last budget?
It can be.
Well, I guess was it? I mean, it happened. Was it fair to the taxpayers of Ohio?
I don't think it was unfair, because when you lower your state income tax, at least the goal was, you lower your state income tax, that helps to generate additional economic activity, which will then raise state revenue. When you tax consumption, that makes sure that everybody pays a portion for the government services. So when you balance those, now I agree with Kurt. I'm not sure exactly where that line is, but I don't think what was done was unfair. We're searching for a goal for more business, economic activity in the state, more people employed.
I think there was a shift in the tax burden on the individuals in the state.
Absolutely, and I do think it was unfair. I think the government spending in Ohio is growing at twice the rate of inflation. If consumers have to make that decision, then the government should do. I don't think that simply shifting a tax is not cutting a tax, and we seem to forget that a lot of times. We say, well, it's shifting a tax for this person, or yeah, we reduced taxes on small businesses. I paid more into Ohio this year than I did last year. I just filed my tax on Monday. So it's not as if it's saved everyone money. Now, of course, we're going back a year, but it's not as if it's going to save it. I agree.
One more loop. One more loop around here, then we'll wrap up and have you guys give closing statements. You talked about great value in your business, how they look for the great value. You become part of the legislature, one of the first things you do, you're assigned to committees. What committee would you see yourself in providing the greatest value to the voters of Ohio?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think I would like to serve on the Judiciary Committee, because that is where we deal with the criminal justice laws. So safe communities, I think, is a very important thing. I would also like to serve on the Education Committee, because it's so important to the future of our communities and our children to have a good quality education that's properly funded. And then for the third choice, I would like to serve on the Finance Committee when the budget is done. So keep a watch over it, have some influence on it. And of course, the committee names change all the time, right. So it's kind of like, well, and when I was in the Senate, I served like on five committees. Chaired the Commerce and Labor Committee, and then it became the Commerce, Labor, and Insurance Committee, and it became the Commerce, Labor, and Financial Institutions Committee. I don't think we had any regulation of credit unions. But even if you serve on those committees, you can still be involved in the legislation that deals across those lines. So I think that's where I would focus first.
And Bob, you absolutely did have jurisdiction of great news, I like to make. But it's very simple for me. Finance and appropriations is first and foremost. I think that's the thing that, the single thing that I'm most passionate about. I also think it's an area where I think I can throw myself into and really be of benefit and help to make tough decisions. I've never been afraid to ask questions. I rarely know all the answers, so I wouldn't say I never know all the answers, but I'm not afraid to ask the tough questions. I'm not afraid to make tough decisions, and I think that's a committee that I worked for 4 years with on city council. It's a committee I'd love to work on with the state. Education, because again, for the same exact reasons, Bob, I do think it's vital to the education or to our children here, but I think it's even more vital to economic development. We have to provide a good education so that we can develop a strong workforce and hopefully give Ohio a long-term competitive advantage in economic development amongst other states. So that would be the second. But I'd love to say financial institutions, real estate, securities. I would assume that there would be a conflict of interest there. So we'll just stick with finance and appropriations, education.
I'll go back to education for a second, about the third grade dispatch. Had a story the other day that said half of the city school district's kids can help back another launch it now. There's a thing that failed on the party line when implementation of that. You support the laws it's written down. Would you look at, I mean, I think, would you look at adding any kind of funding behind districts to deal with
As it pertains to funding, I mean, I think we've gone over that many times. I mean, I think we have to be able to adequately fund the standard that we've set. If that's the standard that we've set, we need to determine what it's going to take to accomplish that standard and figure out how we're going to fund it. I mean, I think that's the conundrum around education funding we talked about all day today. As it stands for the third grade reading standard, I do think it's important. I think that there's people who say that I think California is a state where they base future prison population based on third grade reading level. Because they understand the impact that it has. If you can't read as a third grader, your odds of dropping out of high school or not graduating become substantially lower because you're not going to be able to participate in any subject if you can't read the directions that you have. And when you drop out of high school, we know the increased crime and poverty that comes along with that. So. If there's increased funding that's required, I think it's something that we have to consider. As for reducing the standard, I don't think it's good for Ohio. I mean, I think we have to set standards that are tough and hold our educators accountable, but I think we also have to be realistic. And I think, when you say as is, I haven't taken the third grade reading standard test, so I couldn't, as a third grader, to tell you exactly whether I think it's too hard or whether the test itself is fair. Or the benchmark itself is fair, but I do think that setting a benchmark there is fair.
I think the third grade reading guarantee is important. When I was in the legislature, we had a fourth grade reading guarantee. If you couldn't pass a fourth grade level proficiency at reading, then you could not be promoted. But then you were also given some extra services to be helped get back up to speed. Good. The third grade reading guarantee is just starting a little earlier to make sure that the student can read, and if you can't read, you're not going to be able to do any of the rest of the academic work during the school year, during your school term either. And that's why about 50% of the students in our major urban schools don't never graduate. Now, whether it's the exact one and whether it should be a phase in, for it. That's a question I don't know. I haven't had the input yet when you're in the legislature, but I do support the third grade reading guarantee, that standard. And then we need to make sure schools have the proper tools to implement.
Over the last several years, the legislature seems to be making some moves to shift the Ohio prison population back to, county jails, by lowering the boom, so to speak, and letting the counties pay for that. Do you think that's a good move to try to keep those types of offenders locally? And if not, how would you change the system? I think we're to Bob first.
One of the state did a study by Council of State Governments, I think, helped fund it by who were expert in the prison field and came in to take a look at how Ohio was operating its prison system. And what they found is in the state prisons, a huge percentage were there less than a year. It was just sort of like a revolving door. Their recommendation was to see which of those would be more appropriate to house in local facilities and perhaps for a shorter period of time, assessing a risk of recommitting a crime or committing a new crime, recidivism, while they were there. And so I'm not sure how far along the state is in implementing that, but I can tell you that I don't think that it's appropriate to shove the cost down to our local governments. The state needs to have its share. I don't think we ought to be releasing dangerous individuals out into the public. And if the state needs more prison capacity to do that, then we should do it. Keeping our communities safe is a very important function of government.
I agree, and I think it's for me, it's a short answer. I mean, it's one more way that the state government has tried to shift the burden of basic services that the state provides back to local communities, and then expecting the local communities to pass that on. When we look at higher education, in the 1970s, 75% of higher education spending was coming from the state government. Now that number is 10 or 15%, depending upon which public institution you're talking about. And all we've done is created a system where Ohio students are graduating with one of the highest student loan debt ratios in the country. We've just shifted that burden in the interest of not taxing people or in the interest of not slimming down the size of government. We've allowed government to grow, allowed it to become bloated, and we pass that cost on to the consumer with college, which might be right because they are the person benefiting from that education. But in this instance, this is a perfect example of, yet again, we're going to push that burden down to local communities, and we're going to expect them to pay for it. And that's how we've done it with education funding, and that's how we're doing it with prison funding now. I think local communities have a very good reason to be concerned about it.
I think we should just go to the conclusion here. Yeah, because we're running a little long.
All right, you're getting tired of us, huh?
We said
We've done that well, Bob. We've done that well.
I could talk all day, but we said an hour. So.
All right, well, again, I'm running for state representative because I think, because I believe that I can provide effective, experienced leadership representing the people of Allen County at the state level, and I can be effective from day one. We're losing our very capable state representative in Matt Huffman, and I'll be able to pick up a lot of that right at the very beginning. And I have experience in various areas that are useful in developing legislation from the judicial branch, the executive branch, and having previously served in the legislature and as well as served in the judiciary. And that brings a little different perspective to developing legislation, because in the judiciary you're seeing all the controversies over what the law means, and you see what the flaws are in some of the drafting and development process. So I think I could be a voice to help make more effective laws that work in the legislature as well. Again, my priorities are going to be helping to grow more jobs in the state and particularly Allen County by creating those policies that will allow the private sector to create more jobs. That's low taxes, limited regulations that are reasonably applied, and a quality education for the development of a skilled workforce, as well as making sure that legislation that comes through is not harmful to Ohio families. You do that by reading the bills before you vote on them. so that you know what's in there and you understand what's in there. And that is the way that we should scrutinize things in Ohio. And then use my experience in the judiciary and as a city prosecutor to make sure we have the laws that are necessary so that our first responders have the tools to keep our communities safe. And those are the things that I would bring to the legislature. You know, it was a disappointment not to win re-election to the Supreme Court, but I did very well in Western Ohio and in Allen County and Jersey County with 77% of the vote. And that really has encouraged me to stay in the arena and to do what I can and use my experience and the talents that I have to help fashion the laws that are going to be good for Allen County. And I will devote my full services, my full time to that effort. My law practice is closed when I became a judge, and I have not have any intention to reopen that, so I can devote my full time to this and to work with the local officials, and I think to be very effective in the legislature for Allen.
Sure.
Yeah. In a February poll of Ohioans, 42% listed the economy as their biggest concern. Second biggest concern was education funding, but the economy, jobs, by a wide margin, was the biggest concern for Ohioans. I've knocked on more than 4,000 doors in Allen County throughout this election. The best way to learn what's important to voters is to stand on their doorstep and listen to their concerns. And trust me, they'll tell you what their concerns with state government are. And I agree that from listening to the folks in Allen County, those numbers hold true, if not even more true here in Allen County. I work in private business every day. I don't have the extensive political background of my opponent, but I do have extensive experience in private business. I set the strategic course for 3 independent businesses, manage a staff of about 25 employees, and am ultimately responsible for success or failure. My job is not dependent on a government budget. Instead, I have to work hard and provide value for the customers that I serve, ensuring they receive the products they need, come up with solutions that we run into with government interference every day. I've seen businesses grow. I've seen government bureaucracy try to suck the oxygen out of the engine of economic growth, and I think I can help. I would appreciate your vote on May 6th. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. I want to thank the Lima News and everyone who's watching online for tuning in. We will have a debate, another debate next week, April 22nd at 5:30 at the Lima at the Civic Center, the City Club, with the Lima County Chamber of Commerce and League of Women Voters. I invite you to watch that as well. And no matter who is your preferred candidate, I encourage you to get out and vote and exercise your right to vote on May 6th. Thank you.